Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at a situation where really the most vulnerable, especially children who are in school zones, are often under attack when they're living in conflict areas. And my guest is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Zana Coursen Neff. And Zana Coursen Neff is the Executive Director of the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. She also wears another hat. She co-chairs the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Zana Coursen Neff, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk about Human Rights Watch first, and then we'll move into your second hat that you're wearing. What is the Human Rights Watch? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, Human Rights Watch is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that investigates and exposes human rights abuses in about 90 countries around the world. It takes no government money, and it uses the rigorous documentation of abuses in order to do everything that we can in order to stop those abuses from happening.
How do you identify your countries? You say 90 countries around the world. There are 193 countries, plus a lot of other geopolitical areas out there. But how do you focus on those particular areas?
Well, we really try to look at where the worst abuses are happening and where we can really make a difference. So, for example, in my part of the organization, the Children's Rights Division, we focus on children in war, on children working in the worst, most dangerous jobs, children who are migrants and refugees, and children's right to education, which is so fundamental to every kind of human rights that people exercise for their whole lives.
And our viewers can go to your website, www.hrw.org, to get more information about Human Rights Watch. Once you've documented these human rights violations, how do you do reports? Do you bring them to the attention of the host country governments? Do you try to effect change that way, or all of that plus a lot more?
We do. I mean, in some cases, people will say human rights abuses are like mushrooms, that they grow best in the dark. And what we can do is really shine a spotlight on some really terrible things that are happening that abusers would often not want anyone else to know about. Sometimes that name and shame methodology really works. In other cases, we want to look for what are the points of leverage. You know, where's the money coming from? Are there other governments or UN agencies or groups that are giving money that don't want their money to go to support human rights abuses? Are there other forms of pressure that can be applied so that the abuses are stopped?
Are there situations anecdotally where we can see where maybe what you've done and some other groups have done have reversed the trend, have really helped the situation, improved the situation?
One of my favorite examples, or I would say for me something that's so compelling in my regular work, is to look at the situation of child soldiers, right? I think 25 years ago when Human Rights Watch and other groups were first working on the problem, there were hundreds of thousands of children being used as child soldiers, and in a lot of places people didn't necessarily see the problem with using 16 or 17-year-old to fight. Fast forward to present day, we've seen the number of child soldiers go way down. It's very commonly understood that children should not be used to fight wars. There's an agreement, there are international agreements made now by something like 160 governments not to recruit children under the age of 18, and there are real punishments. So take, for example, the first conviction of the International Criminal Court. It was for someone who recruited child soldiers. And I think, in my mind, that's what happens over a relatively short period of time, that something that no one was paying attention to is now highly stigmatized and prohibited.
Every time I hear child soldiers, I automatically think of Ismail Bey, who's world famous, who was a child soldier in Sierra Leone, but also the United Nations as the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict. Do you liaison with them? They've been fighting this battle for years. Do you work with them on various fronts?
It is such an important part of the UN, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict. And Layla Zarougi, the current Special Representative, has played a very important role on putting pressure on governments, on exposing recruitment of children, but also drawing attention to several other terrible things that happen to children in war, including, as I think we'll talk about today, attacks on schools and teachers.
Exactly. You mentioned Ms. Zarougi. She was just on the program about 3 months ago, so she's on our website. but it did a really interesting program. Well, let's look at your other hat, and you are the co-chair of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, GCPEA. That's the last time we'll use that acronym.
Right.
What is the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack?
Yeah. Well, the Global Coalition is a coalition of nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations, and also uniquely 3 UN agencies, including UNICEF, UNESCO, and UNHCR. I really don't know of any other coalition like that. But our groups came together in 2010 out of common concern that there was a serious problem of targeted attacks on schools, teachers, and students, and we wanted to work together to stop it.
Now, you said UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Did you say UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees?
The
Okay,
refugee
so
agency.
those are 3. That's an interesting conglomeration of UN agencies to bring together, but all concerned with children.
Definitely, and I think that is, for me, something that's very powerful about the coalition is that we are working together, identifying this problem of targeted attacks on schools, teachers, and students as something that we all need to be working together to stop.
And our viewers can go to the website, and this one I've got to read. It's GCPEA at protectingeducation.org, and we will flip it up on the screen because
Correct.
that's a long one. How do you, generally speaking, how do you determine there's attack on education? Is it there are physical attacks, obviously, but are there psychological attacks? Are there political attacks? Is there a whole, really a whole litany of ways you can attack children?
Well, let me give you an example. So, for example, when I was in Afghanistan back in 2003, I was actually there with a colleague from Human Rights Watch documenting something else. And I was asking parents about whether they had sent their children back to school when schools had reopened. And several of them told me an unexpected story, which was I sent my girl back to school and then a grenade was left under a teacher's chair, or the school was set on fire and so I pulled her out again. And those were the stories that we started collecting that didn't look like the story that was supposed to be told about Afghanistan in 2003. When we looked around more broadly, we went to India, to southern Thailand, to the Philippines, you can look at Uganda, to Somalia. We found that, in fact, in wars around the world, that schools, teachers, and students aren't just sort of accidentally caught in the crossfire. They are being intentionally targeted as a tactic of war. And so that's what we're trying to prevent.
And that makes it even more repulsive that they're actually targeting children. That is just absolutely.
It is.
It just is just beyond belief that people are doing that. But now there's a declaration called the Safe Schools Declaration. What exactly is that?
So the Safe Schools Declaration is a voluntary political commitment made by governments to protect education even in times of war. It's a recognition by countries that around the world, even in armed conflict situations, teachers are often still struggling to teach, and children are still desperately trying to get an education, and that should be protected.
Exactly. Are you operating in Syria? If there were ever a casebook example, a textbook example of how children, I mean, literally, who have lost their childhood, come right down to it, that war has been raging, what, 5-6 years now, something like that, and children are under attack, both physically, psychologically, and just on across the board. Are you operating in that area? Are you doing anything in Syria?
I mean, Syria is a terrible example of where schools have been intentionally targeted, and at Human Rights Watch we have interviewed children who have described, cowering under their desks or have had militaries drive tanks into their schools. And Syria also exemplifies another aspect of this that's covered by the Declaration, and that's the practice of using schools for military purposes. And we have documented that all sides in Syria have taken over schools, has used them as bases or as barracks to operate from. In some cases, turned schools into detention centers. And that's not only terrible for children who might otherwise have been going to school there, but it also turns the schools into a target of attack by the other side.
We now have the International Criminal Court that came online several years ago, created by the United Nations, but separate from the UN today, but it's in The Hague. Would any of this activity classify as a war crime, crime against humanity, genocide? Would any of the things you're talking about today fit into one of those categories?
Attacks on a school that's not being used by armed forces can be a war crime. It's considered a civilian object, and the warring parties can't attack it. The problem is, if a military moves into a school or if an armed group moves into a school, it can become a legal target, even under the laws of war. And that's what we have been trying to address with the Safe Schools Declaration and this political process by which governments are beginning to agree and commit to the idea that wherever possible, schools should not be used for military purposes.
Now, you and your partners are having lots of partners, not just a few, not the 3 UN folks, but or agencies, but you're having a major conference in Buenos Aires next month. What is the purpose of that conference, and what would you hope would come out of it?
So this is a really important step. So in May of 2015, the governments of Norway and Argentina launched the Safe Schools Declaration. It's a government-launched political declaration protecting education in war. Since that time, now almost 20 months, 59 governments have signed on to the declaration, which also includes an endorsement of guidelines against using schools for military purposes. We saw, in fact, just last week, Canada and France sign on to the declaration, really making a strong statement that schools should be protected in war. Next month, governments will meet in Buenos Aires, both for those who haven't yet to sign the declaration, but also begin to share experiences about how they are ensuring that their own militaries will have the guidance that they need to avoid using schools wherever possible.
Will there be recommendations that will come out not only for the folks who are in attendance, the countries in attendance, but also for the other countries, still 100 some odd countries that are not being represented there, but to encourage them to be involved and to start thinking about this as a major problem?
Well, there are two outcomes that we hope for. The first is this growing consensus that schools should be off limits to warring parties, even in war, and that they shouldn't be used for military purposes. And as more and more countries sign on, countries at peace, countries at war, we have the majority of EU countries, the majority of NATO countries, countries from every region of the world. I think the position of some countries that they should still be allowed to use schools is becoming increasingly untenable. The other outcome we hope to see, though, is the very practical aspect. It's the reason why we're doing this work, which is for countries to begin to demonstrate the specific steps that they're taking to make sure that schools are never used by their militaries.
And these are very important steps that we need to take. And even if we don't have a war raging in our own particular country, we can still provide assistance to the folks who are undergoing this horrific situation and to help them improve their lives. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved in any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps it's an educational intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you're interested in our programs and would like to share them, we would invite you to go to the website and to download the programs. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how these issues impact us. Today we're taking a look at a very heart-rending situation, and that's children who are caught in a conflict zone and who are not only safe or unsafe in their homes, but also in their school settings. My guest today is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Zana Coursen Neff, and she is the Executive Director of the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. She also co-chairs the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. Zana, we're talking about the situation where children are in these really war zones in many cases. Now, there is a publication, or guidelines, I should say, guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. What are these guidelines? When were they formed? Who formed them? And how do we make people abide by them?
Yeah. Well, the guidelines have been developed in the last couple of years in order to provide real guidance for troops in the field about what to do when they encounter a school. You know, most troops are trained and they follow rules. But we found that when we looked around at the practices of most countries, troops simply didn't have guidance about how to avoid using schools. And so now this process under the leadership of Norway and Argentina has led to guidelines that that provide very simple rules that troops can follow. And they say simply that, you know, if you encounter a functioning school, don't use it. And if you have any other alternative. And if the school is not functioning, still really try not to use it, because even if students aren't going to school right at the moment, if the troops go in and they get attacked by the other side, the school will likely be destroyed if and when peace comes. It says that that countries agree to change their own military laws and policies to make that clear to troops, and also to train them so that they know what to do when they encounter that situation. And as we said before, there are now 59 countries that have signed onto the declaration that endorses these guidelines and are committing to make sure that their own troops don't endanger children by using their schools.
Are these 50, we won't go through all 59 countries, but are they, many of them from the developed world, from the developing world, from Africa, Latin America, Asia? It's a real potpourri?
It's a real mix, and that's why this is so important. It includes countries who have been at war or who are at war now, and countries at peace who are saying, we want to be part of this consensus building, of creating agreement around schools not being used for military purposes. It includes countries from every region of the world, the majority of EU countries, the majority of NATO countries, and as we mentioned most recently, France and Canada. So it's militaries of various sizes all coming together to say, this is a practice that we want to make sure doesn't continue.
Now, the Global Coalition has several goals, I guess you might say, and they focus on how you determine the impact of these problems. How exactly do you do that? Do you go through UN reports? Do you talk to the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations? You work with other like-minded organizations. How do you determine the impact and the severity of the problem?
Well, the first thing that we started to do as a coalition is to just try to put out information about how widespread this problem is. I think in previous years it just wasn't as well understood how common it is in war for schools, teachers, and students to be attacked or used for military purposes. But one of the things we've seen through the UN system, particularly with the monitoring and reporting mechanism that feeds the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict, is that as people have started to look for the problem, it's become very apparent that it's severe. So, for example, in the Secretary General's report last year, there were 11 countries that were added to the list of shame for targeting schools and teachers. And the Global Coalition, we've actually documented targeted attacks on education in some 30 countries in the last 7 years, and the use of schools for military purposes in 26 countries in the same time period.
And of course, our viewers can go to those two websites we mentioned earlier, or they can just Google it. Right. And they will come up with the particular countries and that type of thing. And that has been very effective. The UN has used that for many years, a list of shame for countries using child soldiers, or for countries who are taking advantage or bombing children in school settings and that type of thing. And that has apparently been very effective, has it not? Or at least it's been helpful, shall we say.
It's really important, because there needs to be, you know, consequence, both shame but also hard consequences for doing things that are very bad for children in war. And the Secretary General is saying, you know, there are 11 parties who were added to the list of shame specifically for attacking schools and hospitals, and parties who do attack schools and hospitals should be concerned that they will look less legitimate and that they could even face more serious punishment.
Now, there's a new Secretary General at the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who's the 9th Secretary General. He's from Portugal, former Prime Minister. He's very concerned about this, obviously, plus large numbers of other groups. What, as you and your allies look at this, what are some of the major challenges you see? What recommendations would you make or could make, say, to the United Nations or to the media or to anybody else who may play a role in dealing with this problem to help overcome the problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are something like 24 million children out of school in conflict areas today. That's according to UNICEF. And so when we talk about, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals and ensuring that all children are in primary and secondary school, we have to pay attention to children who are living in war zones. In high-profile situations like the girls who were abducted from school in Chibok, Nigeria, kids who have their schools bombed in Yemen or in Syria, but also the situations that are getting much less attention, whether it's in the Central Africa Republic or other places that aren't getting the notice that they deserve. And if we are not protecting the education of so many children who are trying desperately to get education in war. We are not going to have millions of children in school. And when it comes to some solutions, especially development work, can be very hard and long term. For a country to say schools are going to be off limits to our military whenever possible is a very immediate and concrete step that countries can take to make education safer for children.
And they can do it.
They
can
can.
do it. It just takes the political will to do it. And it
Exactly.
can be done very, very easily. Well, another major initiative of the United Nations has been the Sustainable Development Goals, the Development Agenda for 2030, and they run from 2016 to 2030, 17 ambitious yet practical goals to, well, number one, eliminate poverty, to empower women, to eliminate hunger. We won't go through all 17 goals, but are there two or three that you focus on more than maybe? I know they're all 17 important, they're interlinked, but are there two or three that are of greater importance to you?
Well, I think in this case it's getting kids in school. It's number 4. It's about the right to education. And I'm very struck by the fact that countries are now actually committing not just to primary but to secondary education, recognizing that these days it's not enough to have just a primary education. When you look at children who are at risk of being taken out of school to fight, of being forced to get married or work in the most dangerous jobs, those are human rights abuses that are happening at the secondary level. And to see countries making progress and committing to not just primary but also secondary education for children is really important. And one thing that countries will have to do if they're going to protect the rights of those 24 million children who are out of school in conflict-affected areas is to avoid targeting those schools and not use those schools for military purposes. And that means signing the Safe Schools Declaration and putting it into place.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible.
Get on board quickly.
Yeah.
Well, the situation, as you mentioned, is terrible in some areas. It's improved in other areas. Is there any type of long-term, let's say longitudinal monitoring or evaluation of a situation? Do you do anything after, say, the fighting stops, say the militaries move away, the rebel groups, the military moves away, they move away from the school areas? Do you do any follow up with the students to see how their lives change, how they improve, what happens to them 2, 3, 5 years down the road?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really well established that education is critically important to a country's recovery and to a country's moving forward with peace and for the rights of those individual children, but what happens next in a country. So when it comes, for example, to making sure that there aren't troops in the school when peace comes, that's a very practical step that governments can take. What we've looked at is, for example, what kind of rules are countries putting into place for their militaries. And more countries are actually changing their own military laws and policies so that there's less use of schools for military purposes. One example from the UN system is UN peacekeepers, who a few years ago changed their own military manual to say that UN peacekeepers can't use schools. Because I think officials in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations saw what happened when troops used school, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how bad it was for children. And that's a really positive step forward. There will be schools that are not occupied by peacekeepers for that reason.
And they automatically become a target for someone who wants to attack them. They're there, and of course they convert that into a very dangerous area. Well, in our last 30 seconds, the hardest question. What is your most memorable experience? You've been involved in some very euphoric situations. You've seen some sheer tragedies unfold. Is there one that will be with you? I'm sure many will be with you, but one that you'll remember the rest of your life?
Well, I'll never forget interviewing children from Somalia who had struggled to go to school in Mogadishu in the midst of conflict and described having al-Shabaab fighters fire weapons from their school while they huddled under their desks, terrified of the incoming fire. And I think the difference between hearing those children now 4 or 5 years ago and now, we have 59 countries and counting committing to do something about it, is momentous. But what I want to see is 159 countries signing and making sure that it is unacceptable around the world for schools to be used for military purposes or targeted in any situation.
And when you describe these children huddling under their desks, just totally frightened. It's just inconceivable to the vast number of our viewers around the world who are watching this right now. They may have read a bit about this, may have heard a little bit about it, but we really have to put ourselves in their shoes, think of ourselves under those desks, and to realize how tragic and how devastating this is, not only physically on the children who are there, but on people who are in that area, but also psychologically on them. Just imagine coming out of that and trying to rebuild your life. But it is just inconceivable, and it's hopefully something we're going to take care of. Zana Coursen Neff, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.